All right. Good morning, everyone. Ms. O'Brien, are you ready to go on the record?
Yes, good morning. I am ready. Thank you. And I will mute my phone on my end. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Good morning. It is March 5th, 2025. I'm Sam Bivens with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board, standing in for Presiding Officer Kenzie this week. This is the hearing on the pending petition for assignment of state filed application 25517 and accompanying water right application 25517X01, and the pending request for release from priority of state filed applications 25513, 25514, 25517 unassigned portion, 22235, 23780, and 23781 in favor of water right application 25517X01 of Sites Project Authority. And today we'll be continuing our rebuttal proceeding in this case. As usual, this hearing is being conducted by Zoom teleconference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and the video of this hearing are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording in the FTP folder for this proceeding. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If at any time you experience technical difficulties trying to communicate with us or accessing Zoom, please send an email to the site's email inbox at sites-wr-application@waterboards.ca.gov or to the AHO email inbox. AHO staff will be monitoring the email inbox. Excuse me. Ms. Mullen of the AHO will continue to handle the screen sharing of exhibits and moving along of slides. So if you're a witness today, you may simply ask her to advance to the next slide when you're ready. And attorneys, you may ask Ms. Mullen directly to please bring up a particular exhibit. We'll take breaks today as needed. There will be a mid-morning break, lunch, a mid-afternoon break. And as in the past, I will hold this hearing to a hard stop at 5 p.m. We'll continue to carry over appearances. If there's anyone new who will be appearing, please identify yourself for the record now. Very good. As we proceed, please keep your microphone muted except when you're speaking so that we can minimize background noise. So on my agenda for the day is to finish with the Delta Water Agency's redirect for Messrs. Burke and Wilson, and then we'll hear from the Delta party's final witness, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. And then from there, we'll proceed to the coordinating NGO witnesses, starting with Mr. Marston, and we'll get as far through that as we can up to 5 p.m. today. With that, Mr. Herrick or Mr. Ruiz, are you prepared to bring Mr. Burke and Mr. Wilson back for redirect?
Yes, I see Mr. Wilson on camera, and I think the phone is Mr. Burke.
Very good. And I will just remind Mr. Burke and Mr. Wilson of the oath they took previously. They continue to be testifying under oath and under penalty of perjury. And with that, Mr. Herrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wilson, I'll start with you for redirect here. Do you recall Mr. Ferguson showing you page 94 of Appendix 5B1 of the final EIR-EIS?
Yes.
And that page provided modeling of the potential YOLO bypass releases. Is that correct?
Yes.
And does that modeling output mean that the sites project will be able to release those amounts that were shown?
Not necessarily.
And so that's just an estimate of what might happen, correct?
Yes.
And again, those are average of year types in the 82-year simulation period. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it's not any specifics with regard to when or how much water might be released, correct?
Correct.
And the period covered in that modeling was 1921 to 2003. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that does not include then the last 22 years of hydrology, right? Is that right?
Yes.
Now, based on that line of questioning from Mr. Ferguson, do you believe that the constraints discussed in your testimony with respect to the capacity of the Colusa Basin drain may still interfere with the YOLO bypass deliveries?
Correct.
And same question, do you believe that the constraints discussed in your testimony with regard to the ITP conditions relating to fish presence may also still interfere with the YOLO bypass deliveries.
Correct.
Now, Mr. Ferguson showed you I believe it was a graph that showed, I think they estimated 2 fish appearing at the weir in 1 month. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think he asked you a couple questions about, the magnitude of that or whether that was likely to be really an interference given the low number. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Are you familiar that a CVPIA requires a doubling of fish, including salmonids?
Yes.
And does D1641 include a narrative standard for doubling of fish?
Yes.
And I'll say the state's in the process of developing a new water quality control plan, correct?
Yes.
And I think would you say it's safe to describe that as at least partially an attempt to improve fishery conditions and fish populations?
Yes.
And so whether or not only 2 fish were on that graph arriving at the weir, isn't it likely to assume that there will be more fish in the future given the federal and state efforts going on?
It's possible.
Yes, we hold hope for positive results, I guess. Mr. Wilson, you remember Mr. Ferguson discussed the problem at mile 9 of the Colusa Drain being a low point and that controlling the water elevation issue or controlling the questions about water elevations.
Yes.
And I believe he asked you a question or two regarding whether or not improvements might be made to alleviate that problem. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Mr. Wilson, you've reviewed almost all of the materials in this proceeding, have you not?
I have.
And is there anywhere in the EIR supporting the project that mentions improvements to the mile 9 spot of the Colusa Drain?
No.
Is there anything in any of the evidence and testimony of any of the parties in this proceeding that even mention, much less propose, improvements to that mile 9 area of the drain?
Not that I'm aware of.
Has any witness testified regarding that being part of the plan for the Sites Reservoir project?
Again, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. You recall questions by Mr. Ferguson regarding the existing authorizations for pumping transfer water at the state and federal export pumps, correct?
Yes.
And he asked you, I believe, whether or not those protections meant that any impacts from the sites project itself would be resolved through the existing permitting.
Yes.
Okay. In your direct testimony, didn't you provide evidence that the Yuba transfer was done contrary to the permit terms of the Yuba transfer?
Yes.
And in your conclusion was that contrary to the limitations on when pumping in the South Delta could occur, DWR and or the Bureau transferred Yuba water even when those conditions were not being met. Is that correct?
Yes.
So in your opinion, is it reasonable for this process to rely on other protections to make sure that the sites project doesn't cause adverse impacts?
No, it's my opinion that the board has a responsibility pursuant to the water code to ensure that the findings that it's required to make to approve the application and the petitions for release and assignment of priority, that the board is required to make those findings and condition the permit such that it can base or it can make the findings that it's required to make.
And without restating that, so it's your view that rather than simply assume other protections will exist, that the specific protections necessary would be included in any approval of a site's petition, correct?
Yes.
Mr. Ferguson also asked you a number of questions with regards to the biological opinions and how they create limitations on exports for transfers. You remember that?
Yes.
And you, in one of your answers, you responded that the biological opinions might change. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And then Mr. Ferguson asked you, do you have any indication that they will change? I believe something to that effect. You recall that?
Yes.
Mr. Wilson, are you aware that the fall 2 limitation contained in the biological opinions was changed or waived earlier this year, or within the last 6 months, I'll say?
Mr. Bivens, I'd like to object and maybe raise a standing objection to all the leading questions Mr. Herrick is offering to Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair objection. Mr. Herrick, so first of all, let me back up. Are you, other than the issue of the leading objection, are you objecting to Mr. Herrick's question, most recent question, aside from the leading issue?
No.
Okay. Mr. Wilson can answer that question. Mr. Herrick, I'll ask you to the best of your ability, keep these questions a little more open-ended on redirect.
I will. I appreciate that. I generally am trying to go fast through the redirect, but I'm not trying to step too far beyond the bounds of the rules.
I understand and appreciate the pursuit of efficiency.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, are you aware of the fall X2 requirement?
Yes.
And have there been any changes to that requirement in the recent past?
Actually, not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean there wasn't any changes. I haven't followed that particular objective in its enforcement, so to speak.
Mr. Wilson, are you aware of any statements by the current administration regarding improvement or increased exports in California?
The current federal administration?
Yes, sorry.
Yes, I'm aware of those.
And are you aware that we're in the process of going through a water quality control plan?
Yes, a water quality control plan update.
And I believe you testified, so you're aware of that periodically we have requests for TUCPs or temporary urgency change petitions that affect both water quality objectives and export limitations?
Yes.
So we just covered Fall X2, the view of the new administration, federal administration, the ongoing water quality control plan changes, and TUCPs. Do you consider those evidence of potential changes in protections in biological opinions?
Yes.
Mr. Wilson, Mr. Ferguson asked you at length questions about your exhibit that showed what you believed were violations of the Water Quality Control Plan South Delta objectives, correct?
I labeled them as exceedances.
Yes,
But-
correct. Thank you. And most of that discussion dealt with, I believe it was April of 2010. Is that correct?
Yes.
And regardless of whether your calculations or highlighting were correct or not, how many other violations were on your exhibit? Or how many other exceedances were on your exhibit? Do you recall?
Numerous exceedances over the majority of the drier years. So critical, dry, and to some extent in below normal.
And so questions with regard to how compliance during the month of April is calculated, is it correct to say that your testimony and exhibit evidence numerous exceedances of the Tracy Old River water quality objective?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, have there been any enforcement actions taken with regard to those violations?
I would have to have a little better definition of enforcement actions. I know there at least between 2006 and 2010, there were numerous back and forth in terms of water board hearings and activities in terms of the enforcement of those objectives. But I'm not aware of any what I would describe as significant punitive action taken against the Department of Water Resources for exceeding the Old River Tracy objective.
Given the number of exceedances that you testified to, is it your opinion that this process should rely on the state board enforcing the South Delta salinity standards, or should they have provisions in this permit, if granted, that address the issues raised?
It's my opinion that the conditions should be contained in this permit to specifically address the potential for injury to other legal use of water due to increases in EC in the South and Central Delta.
Thank you. I'll move to Mr. Burke now. Mr. Burke, can you hear us? And are you unmuted?
Yes, I'm unmuted and I believe my video is available. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Burke, Ms. Chester asked you a number of questions about why you selected specific examples you showed of changes in EC that you modeled as being results of the project. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And can you tell us why you showed examples of adverse effects rather than only examples of no effects or positive effects?
Well, my intent in going through the analysis was to determine whether or not there would be any impacts. So when I was reviewing the results of the analysis, comparing the with and without exports or with all three to the no action alternative, I wanted to be able to examine where there are impacts and the magnitude of what those impacts may be. So I selected those areas to display in the testimony so that I could indicate what those impacts might be and what their magnitude is during those durations.
And Mr. Burke, do you have any expertise which would allow you to make a conclusion that would deal with whether or not improvements in water quality somehow offset decreases in water quality?
I'm not an expert in the field, but I understand that once you've added salt to fields by irrigating with high saline water, it's not necessarily removed if 6 months later you have low saline water that you then apply to your crops. That salt remains in the soil for a period of time.
Mr. Burke, Ms. Chester asked you if cross delta flow, which is Sacramento water being drawn to the export pumps, improved water quality in the South Delta. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
And is it correct that you answered sometimes it does and many times it doesn't?
That's correct. It depends on the tidal cycle and the amount of water being drawn down from the Sacramento River.
Now, the export pumps have additional impacts rather than just pulling water from the Sacramento River. Is that correct?
Objection
That's
again,
correct.
leading.
I couldn't hear that. I'm sorry.
I'm objecting on the basis of leading. Again, a standing objection for leading questions.
Sustained. Try again, please, Mr. Herrick.
Mr. Burke, are there other impacts from export pumps other than Sacramento River water being drawn to them?
There are.
And what are those other impacts?
They primarily have to do with the fact that as the pumps export water from the South Delta, they're drawing water in not only from the Sacramento River down through Old River, but they're drawing water in through Old River from the east towards the pumps, which is pulling in more of the San Joaquin water and then also changing the flow direction of water in Middle River. That's causing the Middle River not to flush properly and remove the salts that may be building up from flows.
Do you know if there's any difference between Sacramento River water quality and San Joaquin River water quality in the summer?
Yes, there's a dramatic difference in the water quality from those two sources.
Is the change in flows that you just mentioned, does the change in flows that you just mentioned affect the eventual location of that San Joaquin River water? Sorry.
Yes, what it does is instead of a lot of that San Joaquin River water draining through the San Joaquin River and outflowing through Middle River and Grant Line Canal, it's now drawn towards the export pumps and through Old River and in a reverse flow through Middle River. So it's aggregating now in the South Delta and not able to flush out properly as it would in a no action alternative or in the original condition of the South Delta.
And so the process you just discussed is occurring at the same time that any cross delta water is flowing down toward the pumps?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
The process that you just discussed about the effects of San Joaquin River and its constituents being directed in the South Delta, that's in addition to the cross delta flow flowing towards the export pumps, correct?
That's correct.
And is it correct to say that your modeling, or what does your modeling say with regard to the effects of export pumps in general on water quality?
In general, on water quality, they're doing two things that affect the South Delta water quality conditions. It's lowering the water levels within the South Delta. Therefore, there's less volume within the channels to absorb salt that's coming in. And it's also drawing more water from the San Joaquin River towards the export pumps in the west, which is pulling in more high saline water into the South Delta. And then with those export pumps, in their attempt to try to mitigate the low water levels, they installed the 3 temporary barriers, which tends to somewhat trap that high saline water behind or upstream of the barriers, creating adverse water quality conditions.
Mr. Burke, do you know of any modelers that believe that the export pumps of the state and federal projects do not adversely affect water quality in the South Delta?
I've not seen any reports or documentation that an analysis has been made or decisions or opinions expressed that they're not affecting water quality. It's kind of a void to a certain extent in the analysis that I've read through.
Mr. Burke, do you know of any modeler that believes that the export pumps have no effect on stage in the South Delta? And by stage, I mean water level.
No, I haven't seen anybody express that opinion.
Mr. Burke, have you reviewed the testimony and evidence in this proceeding with regard to the areas of expertise that you have?
I have.
And that includes testimony and the supporting documents and modeling and stuff like that. Is that right?
That's correct. I have.
Okay. Are you aware of any petitioner witness who has shown how any discrete impact of changes in salt apply to any particular South Delta diverter?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Yes, I'm sorry, that didn't come out too smoothly. To your knowledge, after reviewing the various evidence and testimony in this proceeding, have the petitioners provided any evidence examining specific instances of increases in salinity due to the project?
No, I haven't seen any analysis to that regard whatsoever.
Same question with regards to stage.
I haven't seen any analysis with that regard either.
Have they done any analysis with regard to how an effect of a change in EC might affect compliance with the water quality standards?
The analysis they've conducted, which I feel is an erroneous, claims that there is no change in ability to meet the South Delta water quality standards. And I believe that's incorrect.
Ms. Chester asked you, do you recall Ms. Chester asking you questions with regard to, I believe, the Bureau potentially using their site's water to help them meet water quality obligations?
I do.
Are you aware of anything in the testimony and evidence in this proceeding where it's suggested that the Bureau will use its site's water to meet South Delta water quality standards?
No, I haven't seen anything other than statements that says it can be used with that regard, but no statements saying how it could be used or any plans to use it in that regard.
are you aware of anything outside of this proceeding which indicates the Bureau, USBR, excuse me, intends to use any of its site's water to help meet the Southern Delta salinity standards?
No, I'm not
Objection
aware.
goes beyond the scope of the cross-examination.
Overruled.
Yeah, I don't think that. Mr. Burke, did you answer that? I'm sorry.
Okay, no, I'm not aware of any plans or analyses to try to achieve that objective.
Mr. Burke, you were also asked about your source of knowledge regarding complaints about water levels in the South Delta. Do you recall that?
I do.
And have you met with any parties in the South Delta who claim to be adversely impacted by low water levels?
Yes, I've talked periodically with the water irrigation manager for the Pescadero Irrigation District and several of the farmers that I've met out in the fields when I've been doing some of my investigative work.
Mr. Burke, Mr. Soderlin asked you a number of questions about water level issues also. Do you remember that? Do you recall that?
I do.
Do you know if there's any testimony that's been presented in this proceeding other than yours that deals with water level problems in the South Delta?
I know I haven't seen any.
And by that question, I meant anything by the petitioners or DWR or the Bureau?
You know, in the testimony that I've looked through and the documents provided for this hearing, I haven't seen anything where it's addressed that issue to any extent.
Is there anything in the testimony that you reviewed that even mentions that people are having water level problems that affect their ability to divert?
No, I haven't seen anything to that.
Mr. Soderlin also asked you a number of questions about forecasting impacts, and that was in relation to your chart that showed the modeling as compared to the measured data. Do you recall that?
I do.
And I believe you did answer that, yes, modeling can get better and improved. Is that right?
That's correct.
Mr. Burke, do you know what version of DSM-2 was used in the petitioner's analysis of the project?
The DSM-2 version used by the petitioners was version 806.
And is any of the analysis presented in this proceeding by them, to your knowledge, using anything else other than that version 8.06 of DSM-2, not other models, but the DSM-2 only?
I'm not aware of any other versions of DSM-2 that have been used.
Mr. Burke, do you know if DWR has updated the DSM-2 since 8.0.6?
I understand that it's been updated approximately 5 times, and I think it's been recalibrated to newer data once or twice during that period.
Do you know if DWR's released a version of DSM-2 that includes the most recent bathymetry of the area that you know of?
No, they haven't released a version that includes the most recent bathymetry that was collected in 2022 and 2023.
Do you have any information that would lead you to make a conclusion on how long it takes DWR to make such updated versions based on new bathymetry?
Given the amount of data that needs to be input to the model and the evaluation of the different cross-sections, their spacing and flow between cross-sections, it could take them 6 months to a year to incorporate all that information and then recalibrate the model to this new data. Anytime you change the geometry of the model, you then have to recalibrate the model to existing data that's been collected in terms of stage and flow at their flow monitoring stations.
Those are all the redirect questions I have. Thank you very much.
I want to just ask one clarifying question, if I may. Mr. Burke, these newer versions of the DSM-2 model, do you have access to those?
Yes, they're publicly available on the DWR website.
So if one wanted to get, say, the most recent version of the model, how would one go about doing that?
You can go into the DSM-2 webpage on the DWR server, and you can download any of the versions that are available.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Burke. Ms. Chester, Mr. Ferguson, do you have any recross within the scope of that redirect, and that also includes my question to the extent you need to do that.
Nothing for Mr. Burke.
I do have a couple questions for Mr. Wilson.
All right. Where is Mr. Wilson? There he is. All right. I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Ferguson.
Mr. Wilson, do you recall Mr. Herrick's questions about the CalSem modeling results we looked at yesterday with respect to releases to the Yola bypass?
Yes.
Do any of the responses you provided to Mr. Herrick's questions this morning change the opinions you offered yesterday that sites could release water to the Colusa Basin Drain and Yola bypass at the rates shown in those modeling results without exceeding problematic water surface elevations identified in SDWA 84 in the months of August through September and October?
It doesn't change them on an average basis.
And Mr. Herrick this morning also asked you some questions about ongoing regulatory efforts that may that relate to potential improvements in fish populations. You recall those questions?
Yes.
And he asked you whether there's a possibility that those efforts could increase the likelihood, I guess, of fish appearing in the Yola bypass and perhaps the Wallace Weir. Is that correct?
Yes.
And yesterday and I believe this morning in response to those questions, you said with those efforts, it's possible that there could be an increase in fish at those locations, correct?
Yes.
And I believe yesterday you acknowledged that you're not a fisheries expert. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Finally, with respect to your calculation of exceedances of EC at in your exhibit SDWA 82, yesterday you did acknowledge that you did not correctly calculate the April 2010 exceedances, correct?
Yes.
Since your testimony yesterday, did you go back to SDWA 82 and confirm that you had calculated the exceedances in the table consistent with the rules that you acknowledged apply that we discussed yesterday?
Apologize, I did not.
Given your admission that you didn't calculate the exceedances for April 2010 correctly in your table, isn't it possible that there may be other incorrect calculations of exceedances in your spreadsheet that you're not aware of?
It's possible, but they would most likely be in the April period.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
All right. I will thank and excuse Mr. Wilson and Mr. Burke. Thanks again for spending a couple of days with us in this proceeding.
Thank you.
Mr. Herrick, are you prepared to call Dr. Leinfelder-Miles?
Yes, let me get my camera here so she appears.
And I
Mr.
believe,
Biddens?
yes,
This
I'm
is-
sorry.
This is Don Mooney. I'm representing Friends of the River and others.
Yes.
I just wanted to note that we had a slight change in witness order where Eli is going to go, Mrs. Sarian's going to go first as opposed to Les Martin, and just wanted to let you know and the parties know, just due to a scheduling issue that we needed to do that.
All right, hearing no objections from other parties, I think that's fine. And I see Mr. Anderson from my team has his hand raised. Mr. Anderson, did you have?
That was accidental.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. All right, I don't believe Dr. Leinfelder Miles has testified previously in this proceeding, so I will administer the oath. Dr. Leinfelder Miles, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Herrick, I will turn the floor over to you.
Actually, could I have the spelling of her name, please? The court reporter.
Leinfelder-Miles.
Thank you. I see your name on the screen now too. Thank you.
Thank you, whoever did that. I don't know how to do that. Sorry. Dr. Leinfelder Miles, is SDWA Exhibit 100 a true and correct copy of your testimony herein?
It is.
And did you prepare that testimony?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, is this a true and correct copy of your testimony?
Yes.
And is SDWA Exhibit 101 a true and correct copy of your, I'll call it curriculum vitae?
Yes.
And the materials contained upon SDWA 101 are true and correct to your knowledge. Is that correct?
Yes.
Dr. Leinfelder Miles, would you please summarize your testimony?
Yes. Good morning. My name is Michelle Leinfelder Miles, and I'm the Delta Crops Resource Management Advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension based in San Joaquin County. I have 13 years of experience working in this capacity and 23 years of research experience in agricultural cropping systems. As the Delta Crops Resource Management Advisor, I conduct a multidisciplinary research program on crop production and resource stewardship. My job is to translate science into practice by working with farmers to discover and implement new knowledge. I have dedicated considerable time to assessing soil salinity conditions in the Delta because salinity has the potential to impact crop productivity and soil health. To understand how salt may affect crop productivity, we measure electrical conductivity, or EC. In a solution, positively and negatively charged ions dissociate and move toward an electrode of an opposite charge, creating a current that can be measured with an EC meter. Salts impair crop productivity by exerting an osmotic stress that stunts plant growth, by causing specific ion toxicities, or by degrading soil conditions that limit plant available water. These conditions require energy to overcome, reduce photosynthetic capacity, or limit water infiltration and soil aeration, none of which promotes plant health and growth. Applied water salinity, soil characteristics, leaching fraction, crop salinity tolerances, crop stage of development, and irrigation method are factors that influence how cropping systems are affected by salinity. Applied water salinity is the salinity of irrigation water applied to a field over the course of a growing season. Applied water salinity directly impacts soil salinity because irrigation water carries salts. When irrigation is applied to fields, salts are added to the soil. Salts accumulate in the soil at higher concentration than they existed in the irrigation water because evaporation and plant uptake extract water from the soil, leaving the salts behind. Soil texture will influence whether or how salts accumulate in the soil. Soil texture is the relative proportion of sand, silt, and clay, and is an inherent soil characteristic that cannot be changed by management. Soil texture influences water infiltration through the soil profile. Soil texture also influences the ability to leach salts below the soil root zone. The primary management strategy for mitigating soil salinity is leaching. and leaching must be practiced when soil salinity has the potential to impact yield of current or future cropping systems. Leaching occurs when water is applied in excess of soil moisture depletion due to evapotranspiration, or the amount of water that is evaporated from the soil and transpired by plants. The leaching fraction is a term used to characterize the amount of leaching that occurs at a site and is the fraction of the total applied water that passes below the root zone. Applied water and soil root zone salinity thresholds have been established for various crops. These thresholds demonstrate how incremental increases in applied water and soil root zone salinity decrease crop yield potential. Crop tolerances vary across species and assume a 15% leaching fraction. While a 15% leaching fraction may be achievable in permeable soils, impermeable soils are common in the Delta. If a 15% leaching fraction cannot be achieved, then crops may be more salinity sensitive than the tolerance values indicate. Salinity sensitivity will vary over the course of a growing season depending on the crop stage of development. If degraded water is applied to crops during a sensitive stage, this could impact crop stand growth or yield. For example, crops may be more sensitive to salinity when they are seedlings or during flowering. The irrigation method also influences crop salinity sensitivity. Crops that are sprinkler irrigated can be damaged by saline water that falls on crop tissue. The irrigation method also influences the soil wetting pattern. In buried drip irrigation systems, for example, the wetting pattern emanates away from the emitter. Salts may be pushed to the exterior of the wetting front, but remain in the root zone. Finally, irrigation methods vary in their efficiency to deliver water to where crop roots can intercept it. While flood irrigation is considered less efficient, it has a higher potential for leaching compared to sprinklers and drip, provided that soil permeability and drainage are adequate. I have led field research projects where we have investigated soil salinity conditions in the South Delta under different cropping and irrigation regimes. In multi-year studies of a drip irrigated processing tomato field and flood irrigated alfalfa fields, we found that salts were accumulating in the soil over the course of the growing season. In the tomato study, leaching occurred laterally away from the buried drip emitters. Even with acceptable applied water quality, average root zone salinity increased over the course of the study. In a South Delta alfalfa study, applied water salinity and soil salinity were surveyed over 7 fields and 2.5 years to determine crop root zone salinity and leaching fractions. 5 of the 7 fields had low permeable soils, where the leaching fraction was below 15%. While the seasonal applied water salinity exceeded 1.0 decisiemens per meter at only 1 field over the span of the project, seasonal root zone salinity worsened at 5 fields. These results indicate that even where applied water quality is at or below salinity objectives, soil salinity may degrade, particularly on low permeable soils. Dr. Sadat modeled delta water quality under conditions of a no-action alternative and alternative 3, and testified that negative impacts to delta water quality and legal water users are not expected under the alternative scenario. The testimony was based on modeling results where surface water EC was averaged per month, and there was little to no change in monthly averages between the 2 scenarios. There are several reasons why the representation of the data is misleading and the conclusions are inaccurate. 1, monthly averages of surface water EC do not represent applied water EC. 2, there was no presentation of data on soil salinity. And 3, even small changes in applied water EC have the potential to decrease plant growth and yield, particularly if degraded water is applied during a sensitive stage of development or if crop tolerance thresholds are exceeded. I received modeling output from the South Delta Water Agency's modeler, Mr. Burke, which illustrates surface water EC at 15-minute intervals from several locations in the South Delta. The figures also illustrate changes in surface water EC between the two scenarios. There are modeled locations where the alternative scenario increases surface water EC above the no action alternative. When this happens at a time of year when farmers are actively irrigating to fields that have low permeability soils, when crops are at a sensitive stage of development, or when surface water EC is hovering around the salinity objective, there is the potential for harm. Therefore, it is my conclusion, based on the South Delta Water Agency modeling output and my previous research experience, that the analysis done by sites parties is inadequate and a determination of harm cannot be reasonably determined.
Thank you. I think that's the end of her direct.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. Looks like I'm turning this over to Mr. Ferguson for cross-examination.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. My name is Aaron Ferguson. I'm an attorney with Somack Simmons and Dunn, and we are counsel for the Sites Project Authority. I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your testimony this morning, okay?
Okay.
Your testimony describes, and you summarized it this morning, a set of studies you performed on processing tomatoes and alfalfa, correct?
Yes.
And with respect to the processing tomato study, you said that it involved the investigation of soil salinity conditions in a multi-year study of drip irrigated processing tomatoes, correct?
Yes.
And you conclude that using surface irrigation water that ranged from 0.4 to 0.75 decisiemens per meter across a 3-year study, average root zone salinity increased over that time?
Yes.
0.79 decisiemens a meter to 1.31 decisiemens a meter, correct?
Yes.
Did you evaluate whether the processing tomatoes in that study suffered any reduction in plant growth with this change in soil salinity?
No, we did not evaluate that.
Why did you not evaluate potential effects on plant growth due to the change in soil salinity?
The objective was to evaluate how soil salinity changed with the application of surface water.
Okay. So within this section of your testimony discussing the processing tomato study, you're not offering any opinions with respect to how this change in soil salinity may or may not have affected plant growth, correct?
I'm not offering that as part of this testimony.
Okay. I'd like to ask you similar questions about the alfalfa study. You indicate that the alfalfa study involved consideration of applied water and soil salinity in 7 alfalfa fields over a 2.5-year period, correct?
Yes.
And you note that seasonal root zone salinity worsened at 5 fields, correct?
Yes.
And what was the worst root zone salinity meaning that I guess what was the highest, excuse me, root zone salinity measured at the end of the study throughout the 7 alfalfa fields?
I would have to go back and review the study results. But in some cases, the soil salinity exceeded 10 decisiemens per meter. And we would expect changes in alfalfa yield potential when soil salinity reaches 2 decisiemens per meter.
And when you say you would expect effects on potential yield of alfalfa at 2 decisiemens a meter, is that tolerance obtained from the Ayers and Westcott study?
Yes.
Okay. And you note that seasonal applied water salinity exceeded 1 decisiemen a meter at one of the fields over the span of the project, correct?
Yes.
And what was I guess, the highest level of EC that applied water reached for that field, where it exceeded 1 decisiemen a meter?
It was at least 1.3. I don't remember exactly the highest number, but we measured every irrigation. We collected samples of irrigation water at every irrigation that the grower made, and we measured the EC of that water.
Returning to the soil salinity that we just discussed, on the field where you noted the highest measurement at the end of the study near 10 decisiemens a meter, do you recall what EC level that soil in that field started out at the beginning of the study?
No, I don't recall.
Okay, for your alfalfa study, did you evaluate whether the alfalfa suffered any reduction in growth with the change in soil salinity?
When we did measure yield, but we weren't controlling for all factors that impact yield. So the primary purpose of the study was to evaluate soil salinity and leaching fractions. So to evaluate yield was a bit outside of the scope. We did it for the purpose of just getting a number, but the main purpose of the study was to evaluate soil salinity and leaching fractions. We found that most of those fields had a leaching fraction that was below 5%. And as I indicated in my testimony, the crop tolerance thresholds assume a leaching fraction of 15%. So we were well below the leaching fractions that those tolerance thresholds are assuming.
So your discussion of your alfalfa study and your testimony then is not being offered for the opinion that the changes in soil salinity that you saw in the alfalfa study affected plant growth, correct?
I have offered that study as part of this testimony to demonstrate that soil salinity is an important factor to be monitoring when it comes to impacts to agricultural water users.
I'd like to move on to page 9 of your testimony. in the first paragraph, and specifically in lines 2 through 6. You state that Dr. Sadat's testimony that negative water quality impacts are not expected under the alternative 3 scenario is, quote, based on modeling results where surface water EC was averaged per month, correct?
I'm sorry, you cut out there for a second. Could you repeat that question?
Oh,
Yes.
sorry about that.
I
Yeah.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, on page 9 at lines 2 through 6, you state that Dr. Sadat's testimony that negative water quality impacts are not expected under the alternative 3 scenario is based on her testimony on modeling results where surface water EC was averaged per month, correct?
That's what's stated, yes.
And then on lines 7 through 8 on page 9, you state that a representation of the data is misleading and her conclusions are inaccurate, correct?
Yes,
So your conclusion about the misleading nature of the data and inaccurate conclusions is based in part on her use of monthly averages. Is that accurate?
based on her use of monthly averages and the fact that she did not consider any of the factors that influence the impact of salinity on crops, which I also named in my testimony prior to page 9.
Did you review Dr. Sadat's case-in-chief testimony, which is cites Exhibit 110, in preparing your testimony?
Yes,
So you're familiar that within Dr. Sadat's testimony, she offered an opinion that the modeling cannot completely mimic operational decisions, but it does show that there will not be negative water quality impacts. Is that correct?
I understand that she said that in her testimony. Yes.
Did you listen to and or read the transcript of the cross-examination of Dr. Sadat by Mr. Herrick during the case-in-chief portion of this hearing?
No.
Can we bring up the transcript, excuse me, for September 3rd? And I don't know that it's been assigned an exhibit number, so.
I think you will have to assign it an exhibit number, and Ms. Mullen will work on finding that.
Okay, thank you.
Or if a member of my team knows where we are in the numbering of sites exhibits at this point, they can let you know too. I see 4 sites. So this will be when it comes up marked as exhibit sites 424.
So can we turn to PDF page 34, please? And at the top of page, PDF page 34, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, and we can scroll up if necessary, but I'll represent to you that Mr. Herrick asked Dr. Sadat a question about the nature of her EC results. Do you see that? Where he asks if they're all constituted of averages?
Yes.
And at lines 5 through 13, do you see that Dr. Sadat explains that the water quality compliance exceedance plots that are in Appendix 65 are based on daily results?
Yes, I see the transcript.
And do you see where she explains that she's looking at the daily EC results and comparing it with the objective and then determining whether there's any exceedances of those objectives or not, and that these results are based on daily results?
I am reading the transcript where it says that, yes.
And can we scroll down to the next page, PDF page 35? A little further, please. There, great, thank you. Do you see at lines 12 through 15, Mr. Herrick asks Dr. Sadat whether there are any of the probability curves she was just discussing in sites 256 for any of the South Delta water quality locations? Do you see that question?
I see that question.
And Dr. Sadat does mention in the lines, in the subsequent lines, that those results aren't shown in 256. You see that?
Yes, I see that.
So can we scroll down now to PDF page 36? At lines 10 through 14. A little further, please. Thank you. And you see where Mr. Herrick asks whether Dr. Sadat has shown any data. And by that, I understand it. He's asking about data on probabilities or exceedance plots based on the prior exchange. But Mr. Herrick asked Dr. Sadat whether she's shown any data for the Tracy Old River compliance locations for salinity or Middle River at Brant, Middle River at Old River, or Brant Bridge on San Joaquin. Do you see that question?
I see that.
And then Mr. Miko in the subsequent lines, 15 through 18, indicates that the data that Mr. Herrick has asked about is contained in AHO 136. Do you see that?
I see that response.
Okay, great. Can we please bring up AHO 136? Let me just, before I ask you questions about AHO 136, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions about your understanding of the scope of the water quality analysis based on the transcript provisions we just reviewed. Is it your understanding that Dr. Sadat indicated that she did not simply look at monthly averages and she used daily results as those results were presented in exceedance plots?
Given that I've had about 5 minutes to review small portions of a transcript, I don't know what my understanding is of the full scope of her testimony and cross.
Okay. All right, so we've brought up AHO 136. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, have you reviewed in preparing your testimony this appendix, which is an appendix to the site's EIR, EIS?
No.
we scroll down, please? Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Do you see at the top of page 2 where it says the following results of the water quality compliance are included for salinity results at key project locations?
I see that.
And do you see in the chart that there's a list of locations and a list of corresponding figure numbers on the page?
Yes.
And do you see that figure 3 is D1641 Ag Old River at Tracy Road Bridge?
Yes.
And do you see that figure 8 is D1641 Ag San Joaquin River at Brant Bridge?
Yes.
And can we scroll down, please? And do you see that figure 10 is D1641 Ag Old River near Middle River?
Yes.
And can we scroll down to PDF page 6? Do you have an understanding of what this exceedance plot on PDF page 6 is showing, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles?
I would want more time to review it than what I probably have right now.
Is it your understanding, just based on this limited review, that the y-axis indicates the differences in EC between the alternative and the standard?
Yes, but I don't know what alternative is being considered in this figure.
So you're not familiar with the sites project alternatives that were evaluated as part of the EIR, EIS?
No, I have not reviewed all the scenarios extensively, no.
Is it your understanding, based on the transcript that we reviewed and your brief review of the results here in HO 136, that the site's witnesses indicated that the results here reflect daily results?
Again, I don't feel like I have enough understanding, having been given 5 minutes of review of a transcript. So I can't answer that question.
I'd like to ask you a hypothetical. Assuming these exceedance plots reflect daily results and Dr. Sadat and Mr. Miko accurately characterize the nature of these exceedance plots as reflecting daily results, does that change your opinion about Dr. Sadat's analysis, particularly the part where you focused on or her use of monthly averages?
No, because as I stated in my testimony, the surface water EC does not represent applied water EC, which is the water that is applied to the field at an irrigation. And her testimony did not represent any data related to soil salinity, which is an important consideration for cropping systems. Nor was there any sort of reflection on how crops are impacted by salinity.
Assuming the exceedance plots in AHO 136 reflect daily results, wouldn't that be a reflection of the surface water available for diversions in discrete time periods?
I'd like to object. I think the question is misleading. An exceedance plot lists whether there's additional exceedances or not.
Hang on, Mr. Herrick. Overruled.
I'm overruled before I can make my objection?
You know, Mr. Herrick, we're not going to do speaking objections to this. You can make an objection, and then I'll rule on it, and I've ruled. So, Mr. Ferguson, if you'd like to refresh the question for the witness, we'll move forward. Thank you.
Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, assuming the exceedance plots in HO 36, like the one we're looking at here on PDF page 6, reflect daily results, would that be a reflection of surface water available for diversion?
What the figure in front of me is showing is a difference in EC between a scenario and a standard. It is not showing me what the salinity, the surface water salinity is.
The exceedance plot is showing you on a daily basis whether the EC is less than or greater than the objective, correct?
Based on what is shown in front of me, I can't affirm what you're asking me to affirm.
Let me jump in here, Mr. Ferguson. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, how much time would you need to, review the portions of the transcript that Mr. Ferguson asked you about in this exhibit in order to provide an answer to Mr. Ferguson's questions?
"24 hours.
All right. Mr. Ferguson, I'll suggest that you move on from this line, but I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Further on page 9, Dr. Lein, and we can take this exhibit down, please, HO 136. Further on exhibit SDWA 100, which is your testimony, on page 9, at lines 16 through 17, bear with me a second. Excuse me. On page 9 at lines 19 and 20, you state that Dr. Sadat did not present any data to affirm that soil salinity would not be impacted, correct?
Yes.
And do you agree that applying saline water for irrigation can result in a change in soil salinity over time?
Yes.
And do you agree that the only driver of changes in soil salinity that cites diversions to storage or sites rediversions at the export pumps may impact is the salinity of water available for diversion in the delta channels.
Can you repeat your question?
Do you agree that the only cause of changes in soil salinity that sites diversions to storage and rediversions at the export pumps may impact is the salinity of water available for diversion in the delta channels?
I am not clear on what you're asking.
Are you familiar with the site's project proposed diversions to storage and generally?
I am not very familiar with it, no.
Are you familiar with the site's project's proposed rediversions of water at the export pumps that's released from the site's project reservoir?
I've heard, but I have not investigated this in any detail.
Just hypothetically, modeling data that shows very similar EC results for water in the delta channels in the site's project alternative and the no project alternative constitutes evidence that the site's project would not impact soil salinity in the fields that use that delta water, correct?
I am not familiar with the site's project doing an evaluation of soil salinity.
Well, I'm asking you about the relationship between the water in the delta channels that's used for diversion and the soil salinity on the fields where that water is applied. Do you understand that?
I don't understand your question then.
If sites modeling demonstrates that there's no change in EC between the no action alternative and the site's project alternative, and I'm referring to EC in the delta channels.
I'll just object here. That misstates the evidence so far.
Well, I'll just say hypothetically, if sorry, Mr. Bivens.
Maybe, because I'm actually sort of curious about this. So Dr. Leinfelder Miles, let me attempt to paraphrase what I understood your testimony to be. What I understood you to say in response to some of Mr. Ferguson's questions is that a measure of surface water EC doesn't necessarily translate to the EC of applied water. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay, can you explain why surface water EC doesn't necessarily translate to applied water EC?
If the surface water EC is averaged or presented in a way that does not allow a water user to identify what the EC is that could be going on to their fields, then it's not a useful number for the water user.
And is that only a problem with is that issue only a problem with a monthly average, or is that also potentially an issue with daily measures of EC?
It could be because it's a tidal system. And
Okay.
I'm familiar with growers who are monitoring the tides and monitoring the salinity in channels and diverting water accordingly so that they're not diverting water when the salinity is highest.
All right. I may come back to that at some point after Mr. Ferguson is done, but that at least that at least clarifies for me what we're talking about. So Mr. Ferguson, back to you.
Just to clarify your response to Mr. Bivens' questions, I understood you to say that modeling data that reflects daily EC results is still inadequate to determine whether applied EC values will be problematic for crops. Is that accurate?
What I'm saying is to characterize applied water EC, which is what the crop tolerance thresholds are based on, it's important to get the EC of the water that's applied to a field. And that is how we use the salinity of applied water to understand whether there could be an impact to cropping systems. We compare that applied water salinity to crop salinity thresholds, which are different for all crops. But that is the water EC that we use. We don't use a channel. I mean, you can represent it, which is what testimony has done. But to really get an understanding for harm, then I would want to be testing water that is being applied to a field and doing that over a course of a season or multiple seasons if it's a perennial crop, to better understand whether there is the potential for harm.
How many points of diversion do you estimate there are for agricultural irrigation purposes in the South Delta?
I don't have an estimate of that. I figure there are a lot of diversion points. Yes.
Do you figure there are more than 1,000?
I don't know.
Okay. Can you think of any practical way in which the sites project could evaluate the potential impacts to agricultural water users in the way you're suggesting in order to determine whether the project might cause harm?
As a crop and soil scientist, with the data that we have over decades of studying salinity and crop tolerances and impacts to cropping systems, I am relaying to you the science of what we do in the field to understand whether there is harm. When there is testimony that is presented that completely neglects to recognize crop and soil sciences and says that there's no potential harm, there's a lack of recognition of a body of science that's out there that helps farmers, helps scientists in these fields.
Let me ask. Can I ask? Sorry, Mr. Ferguson, and I don't intend to take over this, but I'm just curious. So, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, how would you propose, if you have an opinion, strike that. Do you have an opinion as to how the State Water Board should apply the body of science you referenced in your last answer in this proceeding?
Right. I don't have an opinion on that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I think that'll do it. I hope that'll do it for me.
Assuming the exceedance plots in AHO 136 that we are looking at reflect daily data, do you agree that daily data would be a better representation of applied water EC than the monthly averages?
You're asking me to compare two things that I've already stated are not what we use in crop and soil science to evaluate the impact of salinity. You're asking me about daily or monthly averages, and I have indicated many times in my written and my oral testimony that in my field of study, we use applied water salinity because that is where our scientific body of work has that's the body of work that we have to rely on to determine whether there's the potential for impact on crops.
So my understanding is that you don't believe any sort of modeled estimate of EC in the delta channels would be adequate to assess the potential EC of applied water. Is that fair?
I have not stated anything about how I feel about modeling.
Well, in your testimony, didn't you question Dr. Sadat's use of monthly EC averages?
It's not a consideration, or it's not an opinion on modeling itself.
Well, what was the reason you made this statement? She based her testimony on modeling results where surface water EC was averaged per month. Why did you include that phrase?
Because that does not represent applied water salinity. The factors that determine an impact on crop, salinity impact on crops, there's a section in my testimony that goes through the factors influencing salinity impacts to cropping systems. None of those things were addressed in her testimony.
So you didn't make that statement about monthly surface water EC averages as a criticism of the modeling. Is that fair?
I'm not necessarily criticizing the modeling. No.
You're just suggesting that it's not representative of applied water values.
I'm stating that she did not represent any factors influencing salinity impacts to cropping systems in her testimony.
Wonder if it might be a good time for a break. Does that work for 10 minutes, perhaps?
I was thinking we were hitting about that time. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10:40.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
This is the court reporter. I'm ready when you are.
Very good. Thank you.
This is John Herrick for South Delta. I believe we're backing up.
Yes, we are ready to go. Mr. Ferguson, do you have further questions for Dr. Leinfelder Miles on cross?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Dr. Leinfelder Miles, can you provide to me an explanation of the factors that affect soil salinity?
I named one of them in my testimony. A big factor is soil texture. And that will influence how water passes through the soil and therefore how well that soil can be leached of salts, how that soil may hold on to water and therefore hold on to the salts.
Are there other factors that affect soil salinity?
The mineral characteristics of a soil.
Does applied water affect soil salinity?
Yes, but you were asking me about soil characteristics.
Well, let me ask the question again. I've asked you to describe the factors that affect soil salinity in an irrigated field.
Okay, yes, then applied water could impact soil salinity, yes.
Do you agree that the only factor that affects soil salinity that the sites project can affect is applied water salinity?
I don't have enough knowledge about the sites project to know if that is the only thing that can impact soil salinity, so I can't answer your question.
So you're not aware that the sites project is a project intended to divert water from the Sacramento River and creeks in Northern California and then distribute that water through various channels to end users. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, you've stated it, so now that is part of my understanding of the project.
Okay. I'm going to move on to page 10 of your testimony, Dr. Leinfelder Miles. On page 10, you discuss changes in surface water EC with the sites project as compared to the no action alternative, correct?
I'm on page 10, I'm describing the output that was given to me by South Delta Water Agency modeler Tom Burke. And I am describing what I observed from the model output that he presented.
And is your understanding that that model output reflects the difference in EC at specific Delta channel locations for the no action alternative compared to the sites project alternative?
Yes.
In your testimony on page 10, you refer to sugar cut at channel reach 183, correct?
Yes.
I'm in the view here because I'm going through South Delta 92, which is that modeling stuff she relied upon just to find the right page when you start referring.
Yeah, so South Delta Water Agency 92 contains a number of modeling outputs that are evaluating EC and Delta channels. for the no action alternative and the project alternative, correct?
Yes.
I could not find results for sugar cut at channel reach 183 in SDWA 92. Is it contained in there?
Look at the typo from that.
Yeah, so which one is that?
Mm-hmm.
If I may, and you can correct me or yell at me, it appears that the one that says, excuse me, what page is it? The chart that she used, or the graph, 1, 2, 3. The chart that's referred to in your testimony is the 6th page of SDWA 92, which is labeled channel 85, not channel 183. Anyway, Dr. Leinfeld-Miles, the page I just listed, 6 on 92, that is the chart that you were referring to when you were making this study, even though it's mislabeled, apparently?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So I just want to confirm that you agree with Mr. Herrick's assessment, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. Is it your understanding that the graph on PDF page 6 of SDWA 92 is intended to be results for sugar cut at channel 183?
Yeah, there's a typo in my testimony. Reach 183 should say channel 85. And that is on page 6 of SDWA 92. And that's supported by the fact that I used sugar cut during July and August of 2001, which is what that figure is representing.
Okay. So bear with me, please. You said you would revise the numbering in your testimony and change 183 to 85. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Okay.
And if I may, this is John Herrick again, just to be clear, excuse me, we'll have to check, and we will, with Tom Burke, to make sure that we have the correct numbers in the final presentation here. But Dr. Leinfelder-Miles confirmed that this PDF 6 is the one she looked at when she was discussing what she labeled as 183. So we're just trying to make sure we're clear on what she was looking at, whether or not Mr. Burke or she got it wrong in her number.
I appreciate that, Mr. Herrick. And that was my goal too, to understand what she intended in her testimony when she was discussing that sugar cut channel. So so in your testimony, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, and this would be, I understand, for channel 85, you state that it is reasonable to infer that the increase in surface water EC from the alternative scenario will result in higher seasonal applied water EC and potentially impact cropping patterns, correct?
Yes, because that's what the figure shows.
Would it be appropriate to use the figure on PDF page 4 to assess what I'll call total EC in the channel? And by total EC, I mean the baseline EC plus the modeled change for channel 85.
Can you repeat your question, please?
Well, I'm asking you based on your understanding of these output graphics in SDWA 92 to understand what or get a general sense of what the EC in the channel might be when you add changes that you're showing in PDF page 6 to existing EC conditions, which I understand to be shown in part on PDF page 4.
Yeah, so a difference that is a positive number would be an electrical conductivity that is higher than the no action alternative that is also shown on page 4. So if the difference is positive, then that no action alternative line, if it were to represent the alternative 3, would be the line would be higher. It would be a higher EC because the difference is positive.
To evaluate potential impacts of EC on cropping systems, it's important to know what the EC in the channel is and not just what the change in EC is as a result of the project, correct?
The change in EC between the alternative and the no action is indicating where the line is positive, where the line goes above 0, the difference is positive. There's an increase in salinity with the alternative scenario. Therefore, it's incumbent on sides parties to recognize the factors that influence cropping systems, given that the alternative scenario would increase the channel EC at these times where the line is positive.
Is it your understanding that the change in EC shown in SDWA 92 on page 6 is not reflective of applied water EC?
I understand that when the line is showing a change, that it's not reflective of the EC itself. It's reflective of a change between the alternative scenario and the no action alternative.
Isn't it correct that in order to evaluate potential impacts on cropping systems from EC of applied water, you need to understand what EC is in the channel?
And so to do that, you would add the difference to the no action alternative line to get what that EC is.
Okay, so that's where I started this by looking at PDF page 4. Is it your understanding that you could use the data in PDF page 4 to determine what EC in the channel would be with the project alternative? roughly?
Yeah, you would sum them.
Okay. So can we attempt to sum them roughly for the period that you've looked at in PDF page 6, which is July 2001 through August 2001. If you were to add that quantity to roughly what you see as that value to the value you see for the no action alternative roughly during that same time period, what's the highest EC that you would get?
Probably over 600 microsiemens per centimeter.
Okay. So in reaching your conclusion that the changes in EC that are shown on page 6 could potentially impact cropping systems, did you evaluate what I'll call the total EC as you just computed it?
Did I take that?
With the data in page 4 against any of the applied water EC tolerances in Ayers and Westcott?
I considered the summation of the difference and the no action alternative EC value. Yes.
And so with a total EC of what you said of greater than 0.6 decisiemens during this time period, it's your opinion that that could potentially impact cropping systems?
Yes, and in my testimony on page 8, lines 12 to 17, I talk about a processing tomato study where a salinity, applied water salinity of roughly 400 to 750 microsiemens per centimeter increased the soil root zone salinity over the course of the study. In this case, an alternative scenario that increases the salinity above the no action alternative, even though it is below a salinity objective, has the potential, based on my previous experience, to impact soil salinity, to increase soil salinity.
So focusing on page 8 in your processing tomato study, you say the soil salinity at the end of the study was 1.31 decisiemens a meter, correct?
Yes.
Is that value of 1.31 decisiemens a meter less than the Ayers and Westcott value for 100% potential yield for tomatoes?
Yes. But this study was not evaluating a difference in water operations. This was evaluating soil salinity under a drip irrigation system and how that irrigation method impacts soil salinity. The purpose in this study was not to evaluate whether the soil salinity would have an impact on crop yield. The objective of the study was to evaluate how the irrigation method, drip irrigation, impacted soil salinity.
But my understanding of your focus on the tomato study, after I asked you questions about the results on page 10 of your testimony, was to explain that you can have these sorts of changes in salinity. And I understood you to be saying that that helps support your opinion on page 10, that the the sorts of changes we saw in Mr. Burke's modeling results could affect cropping systems. Is that not, am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, I think you are. And previously in this cross-examination, you asked me if there was a change in yield in the processing tomato study, and I said that that wasn't something we evaluated because it wasn't the objective of the study. So while 1.31 decisiemens per meter root zone salinity is below the salinity threshold, that wasn't the objective of this study.
Okay. I believe, in looking at page 4 in SCWA 92, you stated that during the July through August 2001 time period, with the project results added to the no action results, the EC would have been somewhat higher than 600 decisiemens, correct? Or microsiemens? Was that
Yeah,
your testimony? Okay.
that's based on a very rough addition
I understood.
of the figure.
Okay. And you said you used that information to reach the conclusion that the changes
Um,
in EC that we were looking at on page 6 could potentially impact cropping systems, correct?
I apologize, my eyes weren't looking at the right line, but the summation, I would say, puts it roughly over 800 microsiemens per centimeter, and I'm using the change value between, July and August, where that increase is above 0, and above that, where the no action alternative is showing an EC of roughly 750 microsiemens per centimeter. I'm sorry, I'm not addressing your most immediate question, but I wanted to correct that for the record, is that I was looking at the wrong line when I said 600 microsiemens per centimeter, and I would correct that to roughly 800 microsiemens per centimeter.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Did you use that total data for the July through August 2001 time period to support your opinion on page 10 that the changes we see on page 6 could potentially impact cropping systems?
Yes.
Which sort of crops did you have in mind that could be impacted with EC of water in the channel at that level?
It wasn't with a specific crop in mind. It was the fact that the alternative scenario increases the EC above the no action alternative. And based on previous studies, like the tomato study that we've talked about, even small changes in applied water salinity can increase the soil root zone salinity.
If those changes in root zone salinity caused by applied water salinity do not exceed the Arizin-Westcott tolerances for 100% potential yield, then there shouldn't be an impact on plant growth.
That's contrary to what I've stated in my testimony, that there are times of the year where crops are more sensitive. If the leaching fraction does not reach 15%, then those thresholds are a high estimate. If the leaching fraction is lower, we would expect crops to be more sensitive. So no, I don't agree with the statement you just gave.
Well, in your analysis, you're only looking at changes in applied water EC, correct? In the graphics in SDWA 92.
I am looking at, yes, I'm looking at water EC values, a change from the no action alternative.
So if we hold the other variables constant that you just mentioned between the no action and the project alternative, then a change in applied water EC in and of itself, if it doesn't result in soil salinity that exceeds the 100% potential yield values in the Arizona Westcott study, there's not an effect on plant growth, correct?
I don't agree with what you're saying. No, because you can't hold the other things constant. These are not inputs. These are biological systems. I can't hold a plant constant in a stage of development. I can't plant a seed and immediately have it be mature plant. There are things that can't be held constant, and that's why these results indicate that further study is needed by the site's party, because an increase in water salinity and surface water salinity with the alternative scenario compared to the no action alternative is evidence that there could be impact. A grower can't hold things constant as you're suggesting.
Did you evaluate whether there are any south delta points of diversion near the channels that are identified in SDWA 92?
In this testimony, I stated I don't know how many points of diversion there are, but I think we identified that there are a lot.
Well, I'm asking with respect to the channels that you've selected to present results for in SDWA 92. Did you do any assessment as to whether south delta points of diversion are located near these measurement locations?
I did not do that as part of my study, no.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. DWR, Mr. Soderlund, do you have cross-examination questions for Dr. Leinfelder-Miles?
I do not. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mandel-Rice, State Water Contractors, do you have cross-examination questions for Dr. Leinfelder-Miles?
Few questions. And if Ms. Mullen could please pull back up Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' testimony, I think that would be helpful. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, on page 7, lines 17 through 20, you state that cotton, wheat, and sugar beets are considered salinity tolerant as mature plants, but are sensitive as seedlings. Is that a correct statement of your testimony?
Yes.
Why did you select these crops for discussion in your testimony?
They're example crops that are considered tolerant when they are mature plants, but are sensitive when they are seedlings.
What do you mean by sensitive?
They are sensitive to salinity, so they will be more sensitive to saline conditions than the tolerance values in Ayers and Westcott indicate.
And so what, for example, is the salinity tolerance of cotton as a seedling?
Do you want me to look that up? I don't
It
have
would be
all
helpful if
I don't have all the crop tolerances memorized.
we can move on. Do you have any sense about how many irrigable acres in the service area of South Delta Water Agency and Central Delta Water Agency are planted with cotton?
I don't believe cotton is planted in the South Delta Water Agency. As I already stated, it was an example crop to make the point that there are crops that are considered tolerant when they are mature plants, but sensitive when they are seedlings. The other examples that I provided, like wheat, is widely planted in the South Delta.
And do you have an approximate number of irrigable acres or percentage of irrigable acres in the South Delta that's planted with wheat?
No, it would vary. It's a crop that's rotated annually, so I don't have a number. No.
And what about for sugar beets? Do you have a sense of how many irrigable acres in the service area of the South Delta Water Agency or the Central Delta Water Agency are planted with sugar beets?
None.
Thank you. I know that Mr. Ferguson asked you several questions related to your alfalfa study, and I'm going to attempt not to retread the questions that Mr. Ferguson asked you, but I do have a few additional questions. In your alfalfa study, isn't it true that you concluded that salinity and crop yield were not statistically correlated in that study?
Yes, I concluded that. But that was based on the fact that the yield is impacted, and I stated this in the study, by factors that were not controlled in the study, such as pests, climate. And so it was, yield was something I evaluated, that I measured, but was not the objective of the study. The objective of the study was to evaluate soil salinity and leaching fractions.
Are you aware of whether the State Water Resources Control Board has ever considered your alfalfa study?
I don't know. I'm not aware of how they may have considered my study. No, I don't have regular conversations with them.
Earlier today, I sent the AHO a few potential documents that I was going to reference. And Ms. Mullen, I'm hoping you can pull one of those up. It's the PDF labeled Master Response 3.3. And this will become State Water Contractors Exhibit 3, so SWC-3. And if we could just scroll down so that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles can see the footer of this first page. And do you see in the footer that this document is titled Evaluation of San Joaquin River Flow and Southern Delta Water Quality Objectives and Implementation Responses to Comment?
I see the footnote.
And do you see that it indicates that this is from July 2018?
Yes.
And if we could scroll down just a little bit so we can see the top of page 2, the header. And do you see that State Water Resources Control Board and California Environmental Protection Agency are listed in the header?
Yes.
And then if we can go down to the last paragraph of page 3. Starting on this last paragraph, you see a discussion of in 2013 and 2014, a separate study was commissioned by the Southern Delta Water Agency and performed by Dr. Leinfelder-Miles on production of alfalfa. And then it continues. Is that the same study that you reference in your testimony?
Yes.
And so if you would just like to read through, I think this last paragraph on page 3, and then I'll have Ms. Mullen scroll down to the top of page 4. I want you to be able to get some context of what I'm going to ask you about, but if we could eventually get to the top of page 4, that would be great.
I'm okay if the document is scrolled to the top of page 4 now. I've read the paragraph.
And so in your review of this paragraph, did you see the conclusion, I think this is back on page 3, that the results of the Leinfelder-Miles study show several sites with extremely low leaching fractions, approximately 3% each. And this is far lower than the leaching fractions evaluated in Appendix E. Do you recall seeing that or something to that effect in paragraph 3? Or sorry, in the paragraph at the bottom of page 3.
I saw that in the bottom of page 3, yes.
Yes, and then on the top of page 4, starting with the third line, isn't it true that the state board concluded that even with low leaching fractions, current water quality conditions are adequate to support the agricultural production in the Southern Delta?
That is their conclusion.
Okay, and then I think I just have a few more questions here. And today you're here on behalf of the Central Delta Water Agency and the Southern Delta Water Agency, is that correct?
Yes.
And have you ever had any involvement in either of these organizations, involvement in litigation over the State Water Resources Control Board curtailment cases?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand after the State Water Control Board.
Yes, I'm sorry. State Water Resources Control Board curtailment cases.
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. And so you wouldn't be aware that in those cases, Central Delta Water Agency and South Delta Water Agency have argued that even if the Delta estuary disappeared entirely and actual ocean water was able to flow into what was formerly the Delta estuary, that they could still make beneficial use of the water?
Objection. That's facts, not an evidence, and I'll just represent that misrepresents the agency's position on a number of occasions.
Sure, I'd be happy to have them pull up that that document. Again, this was, Ms. Mullen, this was included in my documents this morning. And this would be the document labeled CDWA, SDWA, opposition to Westlands.
Okay, so I will sustain Mr. Herrick's objection, but Ms. Mandel-Rice, if you want to, it sounds like you want that document brought up, and we can go through the document as you see fit.
And this will be SWC-4 for the record. And if we can just scroll down just a little bit so we can see the case caption here, that would be great. And do you see that the case caption indicates that this was filed in the Superior Court of the State of California in and for the County of Santa Clara?
Is this a question for me? I'm not familiar with this document at all.
Yes, I'm just asking you if you can verify that that you see on this particular page what this document is. Or where it was filed. So the reference here would be to the Superior Court of the State of California in and for the County of Santa Clara. Is that correct?
I am reading this for the first time on the screen. That seems to be what it says.
And in the bold text in the right-hand column, do you see a reference to petitioners, plaintiffs, Central Delta Water Agency and South Delta Water Agency's opposition to intervenor Westland Water District's partial joinder? Sorry, that's a mouthful.
I am seeing this document for the very first time. What you're reading appears to be what it says.
Okay. And then if we can go to the bottom of page 3 of this document, that would be great. And again, I understand that you're reading this for the very first time and have not read the entire document or the context. But I just want to, starting on at the bottom of page 3, line 26, sentence that starts with, having said that, if in an alternative reality, the delta tidal estuary disappeared and actual ocean water was able to flow into what was formerly the delta tidal estuary, CDWA's constituents could absolutely put ocean water to beneficial use. Is that an accurate reading of the sentence that I just read? Understanding that you have not looked at the context of this document.
You're reading the document, so yes.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
I'm not being asked to reflect on that. Or
That-
am I just stating that I read in the same way that she does?
Hang on, you answer her questions, and your attorney will have an opportunity to clarify things on redirect. I expect you will have an opportunity based on what I've seen in that document. Okay. Sorry, where were we? Bureau of Reclamation, Ms. Mitchell, do you have cross-examination questions for Dr. Leinfelder Miles?
I do not. Thank you.
All right, then Mr. Herrick, I will turn back to you for redirect examination.
Thank you. Let's start with that last exhibit, the State Water Contractors number 4, please. And go back to the bottom page. Let's scroll down to the top of page 4 to include the top of page 3. So, Mrs. Leinfelder, or Dr. Leinfelder Miles, you were asked whether the reading of the document was an actual reading of the document. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And the part of the document that was not read was the sentence after the part that was, excuse me, would you read the sentence after the part that was read that starts with the word "for example"?
For example, they could farm oysters or conduct other aquacultural activities in that high salinity water in light of conventional food crops.
So in fact, the document seems to suggest that salty ocean water could be used for beneficial uses, but not for agricultural.
Objection, leading.
I think that's pretty clear.
I'm going to sustain the objection, and Mr. Herrick, you can try again or not as you see fit.
Do the statements that were just read to you and then you read, do they indicate anything with regard to the impacts of salinity on food crops in the South Delta?
No.
Thank you. Let's go back to State Water Contractors number 3. And let's see. That top paragraph of page number 4, you see that, and it was referenced to you in the questions by Miss Mendel Rice.
Yes.
Okay. Do you see anywhere in that conclusion by the state board that there will be no damage to agricultural production with higher channel EC?
No.
And do you agree with their logic that says, since there were places with low leaching fractions and the average yields were okay, that there's no damage then?
Yeah, right. I don't agree with that.
Yeah. And so would you describe any fault in their logic that you may see there?
Yeah, I would, and I stated it in my testimony. Quoted from Ayers and Westcott. The prediction that a water quality related problem will occur requires evaluation of the potential of water to create soil conditions that may restrict its use or may require the use of special management techniques to maintain acceptable yields. So it fails to recognize that changes in water quality that increase soil salinity could have a long-term impact.
Dr. Leinfelder Miles, Mr. Ferguson asked you a number of questions about the surface water salinity in relation to applied water salinity. Do you recall those?
Yes.
In your opinion, if there's a higher EC in applied water and that EC is not in exceedance of any standard, can there still be harm to a crop?
Yes.
And your testimony is not that is your testimony that there is necessarily harm or that it requires more investigation?
It requires more investigation.
And so the modeling results that you referred to that were provided by Mr. Burke, whether they're right or wrong, those modeling results indicate that at times there might be an elevated EC due to the sites project as compared to a no action alternative, correct?
Yes.
And does that allow you to conclude with that information whether or not or to what degree there might be harm to agricultural crops?
It allows me to conclude that more investigation is needed to better understand how the project could impact water users.
And in your review of Dr. Sadat's testimony, is there any treatment of that sort of further investigation?
No.
You were asked some questions by Mr. Ferguson with regard to whether or not there were diversions near the locations for which the modeling done by Mr. Burke were located. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. So in your conclusions about the modeling results, does it matter to you whether or not every single location in the South Delta has been modeled or measured?
No.
And is that because what you just said, that there's a further necessary investigation if there's an adverse effect on EC due to a project?
Absolutely.
Lastly, you were asked whether or not if applied water that was not above the Ayers and Westcott standard or limit could cause any harm to crops, correct?
I was asked that, yes.
And would you explain why you believe meeting the Ayers and Westcott standard is the sole measure of whether or not there will be any impacts?
Can you restate your question?
Yeah. Could you explain why an applied EC lower than the lower than the Ayers and Westcott number could still be of concern?
Yeah, that goes back to the crop stage of development. If the crop is at a sensitive stage of development, that number is a threshold that represents mature crops. And therefore the threshold would be lower than that number. Also, that number represents where there's a 15% leaching fraction, and based on the document that's on the screen, we know that there are places in the South Delta that have a lower leaching fraction. Therefore, that number will be the threshold number in Ayers and Westcott is going to be a number that's higher than what those crops could actually tolerate, because they're not getting 15% of the water moving through the soil root zone, and therefore flushing out some of those salts. That water that's going into the root zone is basically staying in the root zone, and therefore the salts are staying in the root zone.
I said lastly, but this is lastly, sorry. There were some questions to you with regard to your earlier studies on tomatoes and alfalfa. Do you recall those?
Yes.
And some of the questions dealt with your study not having any conclusion with regard to increased soil salinity and the crop production of those crops. You recall that?
Yes.
Now, in order to have a study that would examine whether or not changes in, or whether or not the increase in soil salinity causes a crop decrease, how would you construct that rather than how you did these studies?
I would plant, I would grow crops in potted soil in a greenhouse where I could control other environmental conditions, where I could control the soil conditions. I'd probably use sand in those pots as opposed to regular soil, like in a grower's field, so that I could very carefully monitor the applied water, but also the extent of leaching and also, control pests and climate conditions.
So is it correct to say that the purpose of your studies was to see whether or not the applied water during those years was affecting soil salinity?
Yes, and to characterize the leaching fraction, to know whether we were actually achieving a 15% leaching fraction.
And did those studies, were they constituted in order to determine the crop effect of of any increases in soil salinity?
That wasn't the objective of the study.
And so can the study be used to make any conclusions about the soil salinity's effect on the crop productions?
No.
And as a final question here, just to restate, is it correct that you're not testifying that in any specific modeled or existing condition, the sites project will cause damage to crops, but rather you're testifying that the evidence that you've seen suggests there could be increases in soil salinity, and therefore further investigation is necessary before one can make any determination?
Yes.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, any limited recross for this witness?
I don't have any. Thank you.
Ms. Mandel-Rice?
I also do not have any. Thank you.
All right. And I will assume that DWR and the Bureau also do not, since they did not participate in the original cross-examination. With that, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, thank you for your time and your testimony today. You are excused.
Thank you.
And we will now turn to the coordinating NGO parties for, I believe we are starting with Dr. Asarian.
That is correct.
And Dr. Asarian, it is Dr. Asarian, right?
No, Mr.
Mr. Asarian, thank you. Got a lot of PhDs around here. And I believe you've already testified in this proceeding, correct?
Yes, twice.
Yes, and so with that, I will remind you that you remain under the oath that you took when you testified previously and are testifying under penalty of perjury. And I will turn the floor over to you, Mr. Mooney.
Thank you. First of all, I want to confirm we had sent over two corrected exhibits, WCT 60C and 72C. That was done this morning. It's just some minor corrections to Mr. Asarian's written testimony and his summary. And
yes, we received notice.
okay. So Mr. Asarian, could you please state your name for the record?
Yes, Joshua Eli Asarian.
And is exhibit WCT 60C an accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes.
And did you prepare that testimony?
Yes.
And previously you also testified to this, but I'll just to clarify, are exhibits WCT1 and WCT2 accurate statements of your qualifications?
Yes.
And are exhibits WCT-61 through exhibit WCT-71 true and correct copies of the exhibits to your testimony and relied upon in your testimony?
Yes.
And is exhibit WCT-72 an accurate summary of your testimony?
Yes, if it's the version with the corrections, which maybe would be 72C.
Oh yeah, it's 72C. If I didn't say 72C, I stand corrected.
Yes.
And did you prepare that summary?
Yes.
Okay. And would you please summarize your testimony?
Yes. Can you bring up the slides in 72?
Yeah, if you could bring up WCT 72C, Ms. Collin. Thank you.
And can we put it in like full screen mode, or is that's just how it's going to look? Great. So I'm going to present today a summary of my rebuttal testimony, which will compare evaporation in the Sites Reservoir and compare it to other major reservoirs in California. As I noted, or as was previously noted, there's a few minor corrections in the summary testimony here, and they'll be marked in red, and I'll explain those when we get there. Next slide, please. So this slide is a summary of my testimony. I'll go through this, and then we'll step through these individual issues and get more into the methods and the results. So the Sites Authority has characterized evaporation in Sites Reservoir as being similar to other reservoirs, but that's really based solely on evaporation depth. In other words, how many inches of water will evaporate from, say, every acre of Sites Reservoir. But there's other factors that cause the evaporation volume and the percent of inflow to be higher than, or sorry, strike what I said about volume. There's other factors that cause the evaporation to be a higher percentage of inflow than other reservoirs in California, which is really more important than just how many inches evaporate off the top of the reservoir. So I compared sites to 11 existing major California reservoirs. And in this testimony, I'll show that evaporation in sites would consume a much higher percent of the incoming water than other reservoirs. Total evaporation in sites will be about 15% of the average inflow, and that is 4 times greater than a weighted mean of the other 11 reservoirs. That the weighted mean for those 11 reservoirs was 4%. So sites evaporation at 15% would be approximately 4 times higher. I also looked at net evaporation, which gives credit for precipitation, which falls and offsets some of the evaporation. And if we look at that metric, sites evaporation is 10 times higher than the mean of the weighted mean of the other reservoirs, which was 1%. And so why is this? It's because sites is relatively shallow, so it has a high surface area to volume ratio. Sites has a long hydraulic residence time, meaning that the water sits in the reservoir for many, many years. That's the purpose of sites, right? It's to hold water over multiple years. And sites is also located in an area with low precipitation, low rainfall. And so there's not very much offsetting of the evaporation by precipitation. Next slide, please. So some of the information in testimony provided by sites and other documents in the record regarding evaporation. Kyle Winslow testified about the CE-Qual water quality model. Ann Huber talked about how evaporation affects evapoconcentration of contaminants in her water quality testimony. Chad Whittington and Steve Miko presented on the calcium 2 model. They did not discuss evaporation in their testimony, but of course, evaporation is included in the calcium 2 model. There's emails between Alicia Forsyth and NGO parties, and the Sites Authority attorneys asked a lot of questions about evaporation during some of their cross-examination of some of the common interest witnesses, such as Dr. Tina Swanson and myself, Eli Asarian. Next slide, please. So reservoir evaporation is an important water management issue in California and the Western United States more generally. And that's because we have a lot of reservoirs, a lot of surface area of water, and so we lose a lot of water to evaporation. There's strong evidence that evaporation rates have been rising over time as the climate warms, and as the climate continues to warm, evaporation rates will increase further. Evaporation is a consumptive use of water. Once the water is gone up into the air, there's really no getting it back. It's a permanent loss from the hydrologic system, as opposed to some other uses which might have return flows. Evaporation is a permanent loss. Evaporation from sites is a matter of public concern. For example, the Sites Authority on its website has a frequently asked questions flyer that discusses evaporation, just basically saying, we've looked at it, you don't need to worry about it. And there was some emails back and forth between Alicia Forsyth and some of the NGOs about evaporation. Next slide, please. So to understand evaporation, we need to understand some basic concepts and units. Evaporation is basically movement from liquid water in the reservoir, evaporates off, becomes water vapor, and then goes off into the air. That's total evaporation. Precipitation is water that falls from the sky and reaches and refills the reservoir. And if we take the difference between those two, if we subtract precipitation from total evaporation, we get what's called net evaporation. Now, all of these terms are sort of most simply expressed as a depth, like 20 inches of precipitation or 40 inches of total evaporation. But we can also think of them in terms of volumes, where we apply the area of a reservoir, say if a reservoir is 10,000 acres and it evaporates 3 acre feet or 3 feet per acre, then that would be 30,000 acre feet per year of evaporation. So there's sort of different units for these things. And both of those types of units, the depth and the volume, are useful in different ways. And I'll talk about that in my testimony. Next slide, please. So some information that was previously in the record prior to this testimony about Sites Reservoir is the EIR EIS Appendix 3. And in there, net evaporation is presented as 27,000 acre feet, or approximately 10% the diversion volume. And you'll note my strikeout here. I initially erroneously called this ET, and what I really mean is just evaporation. So that's 3 places in the slide where that occurs. So this Appendix 3 presented net evaporation, and total evaporation was not provided in Appendix 3, but we can simply just add precipitation to net evaporation to get total evaporation. And that's what I did in my calculations I'll talk about in a minute. In my previous testimony, WCT3, because I had not found that secret hidden nugget in Appendix 3 where the authority presented their evaporation, I didn't think there was any calculations available. So I pieced together other pieces of evidence from the EIS and estimated evaporation in 2 different ways. One was based on the salt pond that's near the site of the proposed reservoir, and the other was from the water quality analysis on evapoconcentration. So those 2 were total evaporation, and they ranged from 44,000 to 48,000 acre feet per year, and equate to 16 to 17% of the diversions. Now that we have the net evaporation calculations from Appendix 3, I'm really going to rely more on those, because it's a more thorough method than the sort of the back calculations that I did in my previous testimony. But wanted to present my calculations there from the previous testimony just as sort of a check of reasonableness and agreement between the 2. So during my previous testimony in WCT3, we had some, Mr. Ferguson and I had some discussion about, he was saying, hey, your evaporation estimates are way too high. Ours was only 27, and you're saying 44 to 48. And, that cross-exam was the first time I had seen that part of Appendix 3. And so really the answer to that question is Appendix 3 was net evaporation, and my calculations were total evaporation. So if we just add precipitation to the net, then we can get total evaporation and get things on an apples to apples basis. Next slide, please. So to look at the other reservoirs, I got a list of the 12 largest reservoirs in California that have approximately a storage of approximately 1 million acre feet or more. And that gave me maximum volume of each reservoir. I excluded San Luis Reservoir because I could not find inflow data for San Luis, and it's really operated in a different way than other reservoirs, where it's used for pump hydro storage and water is kind of moving in and out on a daily basis. So I excluded San Luis and looked at those other 11 reservoirs. For surface area and total evaporation, I used the Global Lake Evaporation Volume Dataset, or GLEV. This is a really high quality, peer-reviewed data set that presents a monthly time series for over 40 years. That, or almost 40 years. It gets the surface area from the Landsat satellite, and then for evaporation volume, that's calculated based on physically based energy balance equations. Next slide, please. For precipitation, I obtained data from PRISM, which is it's probably the single most widely used precipitation data set. It's gridded data that combines, I think it's something like 20,000 ground-based weather stations across the United States, uses data from geographic information systems and a statistical model, and sort of combines those together to get a continuous prediction of precipitation across space and time. I extracted monthly data for the same time period as I used for the evaporation. Then to look at reservoir inflow for most of the reservoirs, for 10 of them, I got long-term average inflow data from the NOAA California Nevada River Forecast Center. They did not publish values for Lake Almanor. And so for that one, fortunately, there's 2 USGS gauges that are downstream. And so I also added evaporation and subtracted precipitation to give an estimate of long-term average river inflow that is comparable with the River Forecast Center numbers for the other 10 reservoirs. And in my initial slide, I forgot to mention that I deducted precipitation, so I made that correction here. It was correctly described in the written testimony and in my calculation file that I provided. Next slide, please. So I converted everything to long-term averages. That's approximately a 40-year period. Converted all units to volumes in thousands of acre feet. And then I calculated 3 variables for sites and the 11 reservoirs. That's precipitation, total evaporation, and then net evaporation is the difference between those 2. And I expressed them both as a depth, like inches, and then a volume per year in 1,000 acre feet, and also express them as a percent of the river inflow to those reservoirs. To compare sites with the other reservoirs, I calculated a weighted average of the data from the other reservoirs. So that's calculated as the total volume of evaporation in those other reservoirs divided by the total amount of inflow. So it's a weighted average that gives those big reservoirs proportionally more weight because they're doing, much more work in the California hydrologic water storage system. The largest reservoirs like Shasta and Oroville are just holding an incredible amount of water. And so when we're trying to compare sites, I wanted to compare sites to sort of the aggregate California water storage system. And so the most appropriate statistic to use to compare those is to weight the reservoirs according to the total volume of the evaporation and inflow, and not pretend that they're all equal, because they're not equal. I also calculated some metrics of reservoir shape and volume. It's called morphometry. It's the average depth at maximum volume. So what is the average depth of the reservoir when it's full to the maximum level? And then I also calculated the ratio between that maximum volume when it's full and how much water comes in on an average year. Next slide, please. So this table here, I don't expect you to read numbers in here, but I just wanted in one place in case we need to reference it, the data for all of the 11 reservoirs. And then I have 2 columns there on the left for sites. One is the information from the EIS EIR, and that's what I'll rely on primarily. I did put my salt pond based estimate in there, but I'm really going to pretty much just ignore that and focus on the CalSim results. The rows in red there are data that we'll drill into, and I'll show you graphs of them in later slides. The only thing I want you to see in this slide is to look at it's the fifth from the bottom, the total evaporation in inches per year. You'll see there really is not that much difference in evaporation depth across the reservoirs. It ranges from a maximum of 58 inches at McClure to a minimum of 42 at Almanor, but really that's a pretty tight range. So the big differences in evaporation between the reservoirs is not how many inches of water evaporate off the surface of the reservoir. The big differences are in evaporation is other factors like the average depth of the reservoir or how much inflow the reservoir gets. That's what really affects the evaporation in terms of its effects on water supply. Next slide. So this plot here, and I'll start by saying that the original slide that I prepared here did not show net evaporation in the legend. The figures that were in the written testimony did correctly, but when I enlarged the font to put it on here, that accidentally got cut off. So I corrected the legend here. This plot shows evaporation, both total in blue or red is net. So evaporation as a percent of reservoir inflow. And you'll see that there's a really large range across these reservoirs, right? Next slide, please. So there's three reservoirs that really stand out here. There's Berryessa, Sites, and Almanor. So Sites, as I stated in my summary, Sites will evaporate 15% total evaporation as a percent of volume, or 10% net evaporation as a percent of inflow. I realized I misspoke a couple seconds ago when I said 15% of volume. I meant 15% of inflow. So what makes these three reservoirs different? And I'll explain that in the next slide. Next slide, please. So one of the factors is that Sites Reservoir is very large relative to its inflow. So it's the maximum volume of Sites is 5.4 times what the average annual inflow is. So when Sites fills, that water is going to sit in there for years. So that's a really long time for evaporation to operate on that reservoir. Whereas some other reservoirs like Folsom is very small, and so the water doesn't stay in there that long. So that's one factor. Those three, or two of those three high evaporation reservoirs have very high residence time. Next slide, please. So if we take that metric we were just looking at there, that's now it's the y-axis, the ratio of maximum storage to average reservoir inflow. Next slide. That single variable explains 60% of the variation in evaporation as a percent of reservoir inflow. And of course, we'll see our three friends here: Sites Reservoir, Lake Berryessa, and Lake Almanor. Those are really the three kind of outliers, right? And so this is one of the factors that explains that. Next slide, please. Sites Reservoir and the other three reservoir, the other two, Berryessa and Almanor, those three outliers, are really quite shallow compared to the other reservoirs. So Sites is not as shallow as Berryessa and Almanor are, but it's a lot more shallow than some of the other large reservoirs like Shasta or Oroville. So it has a very high surface area to volume ratio. So evaporation is operating at the surface layer, right? And so what happens at the surface of Sites, because it's shallow, has a disproportionate effect on the whole reservoir. Next slide, please. Sites is also located in an area that has relatively low rainfall, only 19 inches of rain per year, which there are other reservoirs, as you see here, that have low rainfall, but some have really high rainfall, like Shasta. Shasta gets way more rain than it gets than evaporation. So, there's a good place to build a reservoir. But Sites is, area of low rainfall, so evaporation is going to have a greater effect there. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So in conclusion, to re-summarize what I said in the first slide, the evaporation in Sites Reservoir is going to consume a much higher percent of incoming water than most other major reservoirs in California. For total evaporation, Sites will evaporate about 15% of the incoming flow, and that's 4 times greater than that aggregate average of the 11 reservoirs. That was 4%. So 15% is approximately 4 times greater than 15%. Or sorry, 15% is approximately 4 times greater than 4%. If we look at net evaporation, which gives credit for precipitation, the net evaporation in sites is going to be about 10%. And that's approximately 10 times greater than that aggregate weighted mean of the 11 reservoirs. That was 1%. So 10% is approximately 10 times greater than 1%. And so why is that? Sites is shallow, so it has a high surface area to volume ratio. So what happens at the surface has a disproportionate effect on the volume of water. Sites has a long hydraulic residence time, so that water is going to sit in there for multiple years. And evaporation is not just going to operate in a single summer, it's going to operate through multiple summers. And Sites has a relatively low rainfall, so not that much of the evaporation is offset compared to some other reservoirs. So the 3 of those factors together is kind of like a triple whammy, really, that all those things combine together to make the evaporation in Sites much higher than the other reservoirs. So when the Water Board is considering, whether it is in the public interest to build and operate this reservoir, the disproportionate evaporation in Sites relative to other surface water reservoirs should be considered, and also considered in light of other things like groundwater recharge, where you might, expose the water to evaporation for a few weeks in the wintertime compared to, and you'd have really, very little evaporation there compared to a surface reservoir where the water is sitting there for years. So just things that need to be taken into consideration in these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sarian. I think we are probably at the point where it's a good idea to take a lunch break. Before we do that, I'll look to you, Mr. Ferguson. How long do you expect to spend cross-examining Mr. Sarian?
About an hour and 15 minutes.
Very good. And Mr. Soderlund, will you have cross-examination questions for Mr. Sarian, and if so, for how long, roughly?
I will not, thank you.
And how about you, Ms. Mandel-Rice?
I do not anticipate having questions for Mr. Asarian. Thanks.
Very good. And Ms. Mitchell, will you have questions for Mr. Asarian?
I do not anticipate having questions. Thank you.
Very good. All right. With that, let's take a hour-long lunch break. We'll come back at let's round up 1 o'clock, and we'll resume with Mr. Asarian's cross-examination by the Sites Project Authority. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.